Good evening, everybody. We have the pleasure of having Clyde Prestowitz with us. Clyde is one of the most authoritative, most leading thinker in the field of geopolitics and you trade, U.S. position in the world, China. He's very much focused on the Cold War going on between China and the US and the trade position of the US vis-a-vis the rest of the world. China is the author of many highly read uh, books on Japan, on Asia, on East Asia, Middle East. He's a famous writer in the US, and he has been part of the Reagan administration for many years. He has been appointed by Bill Clinton a number of positions in important international bodies, and we are very pleased and honored to have Clyde with us tonight. Go ahead, Fabio.
No, I just want to join you in thanking Clyde for his kindness and for having agreed to be with us, even though he had a small surgery, as you can see, and nothing serious. But nevertheless, he's been extremely kind to share his thoughts with us. So I would say the first items, first item on our list is this Cold War, the second Cold War they call it, between the US and China. Okay. What do you think are the most salient, the most important feature of this Cold War, and how dangerous it is for the near future, for the prospect of the, I would say, Western OECD countries, to be a little bit more um, inclusive, and what should we look at? What are the issues? What are the elements that should be critical or that you deem critical in this new Cold War?
So let me go back a little bit in history. I think that what's happening now is kind of a rendezvous with reality that has been delayed and delayed for a long time. I led the first American trade mission to China in the fall of 1982, and I was astounded. It was the first time I had been to China. I was astounded by the poverty. I had never seen such a poor country. And I had with me about 100 American CEOs and business leaders. In the United States, my group, the Reagan administration, we were urging these American business leaders to do business with China, to invest and export, import, do business with China. And they did. And from that time, about 1982 until, let's say, 1989, the Chinese economy grew pretty rapidly. And American investment and trade with China grew also dramatically. But they grew within the context of an agreement and a particular form. China relaxed its regulations on foreign investment and tried to attract foreign investment. And the US relaxed its barriers to imports from China, but not wholly. And so, for example, every year in the US, we had a congressional review and a congressional vote on whether or not to continue granting most favored nation treatment to China. And we did, every year we did that. And in that period, in that context, the trade with China went pretty well. Okay, then you get to 1989 and you have the event in Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese Communist Party unleashed its army against students protesting or calling for freedom and democracy in China. George H.W. Bush was president at that time. I had worked for George H.W. Bush on his staff. I had great admiration for him. But he did something that I have never quite understood and that I think has turned out to be a difficult problem. At the moment of the protest in China, you remember that the Chinese army opened fire, killed, we don't really know how many, but at least 700 kids, probably a lot more. And Bush immediately sent his security advisor to China to meet with Deng Xiaoping, and the message was, "Don't worry, I'll stop the boats from rocking. I'll have to take certain measures. Please understand that, but basically, don't worry." I personally was shocked by that message. I thought it was the wrong message then, and I'm convinced now that it in fact was the wrong message. But it opened an era in U.S.-China economic relations that I think proceeded in the context of hope, a lot of misunderstanding, and misperception. Let me say what I'm explaining that in detail. The argument in the United States was that free trade, open trade, inevitably leads to democracy. Bush, for whatever reasons, was convinced by that argument. If we could just trade with China, they'll become more amenable, they'll become more open. Being more open, they'll inevitably move into democracy. Now, Bill Clinton came along, and he campaigned in his 1992 campaign for the presidency. He had this slogan: "No dictators, no dictators from Baghdad to Beijing." So that was a very tough line. It sounded like Bill Clinton was going to take a hard line and maybe change our trade relation with China, as long as it was a dictatorship. But once Clinton became president, the line changed, and we started talking about engagement, positive engagement. And so we continued with this review every year of most favored nation treatment, and we kept granting it every year. And the trade grew dramatically. But then in 1997, a very important event occurred, which was the initiation by China of the Great Firewall. Essentially, China separating its internet from the global internet. You might have thought that Clinton would would be disappointed, would be upset. But no, Clinton's comment was, "Ha ha ha, it'll never work. It'll be like trying to nail Jello to the wall." And so the US continued with this very open trade policy in the face of a clear declaration by China that it was not going to allow its internal market to be messed up by crazy Western thinking or communication. And so then we get into bringing China into the WTO. And in the US and other countries, the EU and other countries, we negotiated to bring China into the WTO, which had the following very important characteristic. I mentioned that the US had been reviewing yearly whether to grant most favored nation treatment. Once China came into the WTO, that review vanished. China had permanent most favored nation treatment. Um, and, um, and that generated enormous new trade and investment. Now, when it was the Clinton and the early days of the George W. Bush administration that oversaw bringing China into the WTO. And when they presented this to the U.S. Congress, the argument was that China will have to reduce its tariffs by a lot in order to come into the WTO, whereas the U.S. has already low tariffs, and so it won't have to reduce any tariffs. And so U.S. exports to China will grow rapidly. Chinese exports to the U.S. will not grow rapidly, and the U.S. trade deficit with China will shrink. Now, Charlie Barshevsky, the U.S. trade representative at the time, made that statement to the U.S. Congress. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, all the major press made those statements to the American public. Fast forward 5 years, and the U.S. trade deficit hasn't declined; it has increased threefold. And companies like Apple, for example, have moved their production to China. Let me dwell a little bit on Apple. Everything that Apple makes, everything, if you buy Apple computers or Apple phones or whatever it is you buy, all of that technology originated in the U.S. Advanced Research Project Agency, a U.S. government agency, industrial policy. Apple in 1998 made the decision to move its production from California to China. And so everything that Apple makes, it makes it in China. And everything it makes in China originated with the US government program to develop high technology. Other companies, major companies, did the same thing. And with the result that these companies began to develop large workforces in China. They flourished globally, and they actually increased the American trade deficit with China. Then you get to 2015 about, and China expresses this new policy of made in China 2025. And it identified all the products, semiconductors, advanced telecommunications, et cetera, to be made in China 2025. So that, really ran counter to the notion that China was to become more open, or to the notion that China was going to abide by the rules of the WTO. And there began to be increasing concern in the US and I think in the EU and with Japan, other major trading nations, that they were creating a Frankenstein monster. They had all thought that China was going to become like them, both economically and politically, and it didn't seem to be working that way. So now today, right?
Sorry, Clyde, can I jump in here to make a couple of points?
Sure, please.
When China joined the WTO, many people said, look, this was going to be an improvement, not only because the trade deficit will shrink, but also because the most favored nation clause, the status, will, is granted without any commitment from the Chinese part. While if you are in the WTO, you are within a set of rules with a court. You can challenge decisions. You can challenge you can bring China to court if they don't stick to the rules. So it's a more it's a better framework, and in my view, they underestimated the fact that the WTO is an old set of rules. In other words, it focuses too much on tariffs but it doesn't focus on rules. It doesn't focus on subsidies. It doesn't focus on how goods are produced, how much support they get from the government. And the other issue is that when you take a Chinese company to court in China because it violates intellectual property rules, patent, and so on and so forth, the Chinese court will never rule in favor of the foreign company or the foreign entity. So, in that sense, China's accession to the WTO was, I don't want to say a sham, but definitely it did not yield the results, the outcomes that one would have hoped. Am I wrong on this,
Oh
or
no,
am I exaggerating?
you're exactly right. And I would make another comment along the same line. So in the George W. Bush administration, a guy named Robert Zoellick was the U.S. trade representative, and he made this statement that we want China to be a responsible stakeholder in the rules-based global system. Now, this presumed that China was going to play by the rules, that its rules were going to be those of the other members of the trade system, and that it would offer the same fairness and treatment in China as China was getting outside. Now, the problem was that China never really wanted to be a responsible stakeholder in our system. China was building its own system. And you see that today with the BRICS and the Belt and Road programs. And I think a major element in the whole story is that the China experts of the US and the China experts of the EU misunderstood China. Maybe they could read and speak Chinese, but they didn't really fully understand what the Chinese were telling them, or they didn't bother to dig below what the Chinese were telling them to find out the real truth. The idea of a rule of law is completely foreign. It's contrary to the concept of Chinese government regulation and control of politics. The notion of a corporation, let's say, challenging a government and taking it to court and winning, that doesn't happen in China. In fact, I tell you a good story. Apple Corporation, of course, produces iPhone. And a few years ago, there was a shooting in California, Bakersfield, California, and the shooter dropped his iPhone. So the FBI, the American police, got a hold of that phone, and they wanted to open it to see if they could find something about the shooter. Apple refused to open the phone. Apple said, no, we have obligation to our customers. We can't reveal their information. They refused to play ball. Eventually, the FBI found another way to open the phone, and they solved the problem. But let me fast forward now to 2019. In 2019, there were demonstrations in Hong Kong, students demonstrating against the takeover of Hong Kong by Beijing. There was an app in the Apple App Store called Hong Kong Map Live. If you had that app, you could see Hong Kong in real time. So the kids had the app. They were looking at Hong Kong. They were saying, the police are over here. Okay, we'll demonstrate over there. This was driving the Hong Kong police crazy. They complained to Beijing. Beijing let it be known that they didn't want that app in the App Store. And within 2 days, that app was out of the App Store. So, there's a huge gap here between the government, the way China governs, and the way democratic countries in the West govern. we kept assuming, people like Zealot, and I would say the elite of the US economic community and the business community, they kept arguing that more trade would create more open politics and the rule of law in China. This was total nonsense. Now, today, we're beginning to face that nonsense. Janet Yellen, US Secretary of the Treasury, is in Beijing as we speak. And she's trying to negotiate something with the Chinese to prevent the Chinese from flooding the global markets with exports in the coming year. Why is she doing that? The Chinese economy, as you know, is in trouble. Its real estate business has collapsed. Consumption in China has dropped substantially. China is in an economic mess. And to solve that problem, it is emphasizing exports. And so China is exporting everything it possibly can to the global market, dumping products on the global market, selling below cost, violating WTO rules in doing so. And that is posing a problem for the US and for the other major democratic and trading nations, because they are being flooded with these Chinese products that are being dumped in their market. So Yellen is trying to persuade Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials that they need to hold back on this export, this huge export program. Now, and one of the other things that has come along in the meantime is this notion of decoupling, or what Janet Yellen calls de-risking. Earlier in the year, or last year, the U.S. security advisor to the president made the comment and adopted the policy that in some areas of technology, we have to decouple from China. And why decouple? Because China is achieving a degree of parity with Western technology. And this is not helping the international security scene. Janet Yellen shies away from decoupling in total. So she talks about de-risking. But however you say it, decoupling, de-risking, the notion that some or all of our free open markets have to have a different relationship with China is a recognition that the way the Chinese are playing the globalization game is not the same way that the democratic countries are playing the globalization game. And it's hurting the democratic countries. And so we're seeing a reaction against complete open markets for Chinese goods in the democratic countries. And we're also seeing a reconsideration of the security relationship with China. And I would say we're having a more realistic evaluation of what China really is. I think people no longer expect that China is going to be democratized through free trade. But how we're going to do it and how it's going to, the challenge today, the main challenge for the US and for the EU and other major trading nations, the main challenge is how are we going to deal with China, both economically and politically? And I think, after a long period of fooling ourselves, we're beginning to wake up and we're beginning to at least consider more reasonable, more practical measures.
But I'm kind of happy about what you're saying, because I wrote a book in Italian. Unfortunately, it's not been translated in English, entitled "The Millennium's Theft," on these unfair practices by China, which range from intellectual property theft to taking advantages of WTO rules. So I'm glad that without knowing each other before today, we share the same view. But the
Well, that's
question
because
is,
we're such brilliant guys.
thank you. No, but the question is, are we too late
Yeah,
to
yeah.
intervene? Are we too late to do anything meaningful and decisive in resetting the relationship between China and West, or I would say not only West in terms of Europe and US, but also Japan, Australia, and
Sure,
the
sure,
whole
sure.
OECD countries.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's too late. I think I wish that we had woken up sooner, but I don't think it's too late. I think that um, you know both the countries that you just mentioned are resilient. They have strong economies, um, and I think one of the most difficult aspects is that China has effectively captured a significant part of our corporate leadership. So, if I look at Tim Cook, the chairman of
Mm.
Apple, um, Tim often testifies before the US Congress, and he always introduces himself as an American CEO. I don't think Tim is an American CEO. I think he's more of a Chinese CEO. Um, and I think that that's why I say we need to rethink a little bit in the democratic countries. We need to rethink the relationship between our governments and the global corporations. And we need to rethink, as you pointed out, the rules of the World Trade Organization are not adequate to the task. The World Trade Organization is not helpful at all in dealing with these issues. So I think we have to look past the World Trade Organization and develop alternative approaches. Now, what I'm about to say applies for American corporations. It would apply less for European corporations or Japanese corporations, but it still has some significance. And so here's what I'm going to say. The corporation, in any country, a corporation is chartered. A corporation doesn't just create itself. It has to get the approval of the government before it can be established as a corporation. And the reason for that is because the charter of incorporation includes a huge gift from the government to the business group that's creating the corporation. And that gift is limited liability. What that means, of course, is that if you start a business and you have a failure, your lenders or your customers, they can sue you for reimbursement, but they cannot take away your livelihood. They cannot take your house. They can't take your car. They can take your company, but they cannot take you and throw you in jail. This is a huge gift that that countries give to corporations. And in return for that, the corporation is expected to do something good for the citizens. It's supposed to create jobs and wealth and pay taxes, and so that the whole country is improved by dint of this incorporation. But what has been happening is that we tried to turn China into a democratic country through trade. And in doing so, we gave a great deal of power to a non-democratic country. In China, the law doesn't work that way in China. In China, they can take you away. They can throw you in jail if they want. Being incorporated in China doesn't guarantee you against anything. It's only the government that really controls all of it. So what I think is that we need to reduce the power, the political power of corporations in the politics of democratic countries. So in the United States, for example, Apple and other major corporations, they make huge donations to political campaigns. They have a huge role to play in determining who becomes the president or the senator or whatever the position is. Now, that's not true in a lot of democratic countries. Canada, for example, does not allow corporations to engage in dealing with political donations. But in the U.S. we do, and it really dirties and it makes American politics a very problematic issue. So I think one thing that
No,
all of us
can
need to,
can I be a little bit more specific on this? If
yeah,
I, as an Italian citizen, want to donate to a presidential candidate in the U.S., and I'm
right,
somebody who supports Western values, I'm keen on the American way of life, I cannot do it. I'm prevented from donating
yes,
as a
yes, right,
somebody who makes half of its revenues from China and owes its success to the whims of a foreign government, just because it's incorporated in the US,
right,
can influence the outcome of a presidential election because that corporation can donate, can support, can give resources to one of the candidates, or sometimes to both. So they
yes,
can play, you know, they can
yes,
hedge their bet and come up successfully no matter who wins the
yeah.
elections, which
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, no, exactly.
absolutely
It's corrupt. It should be stopped. It's corrupt. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to attack that problem. But I think that it's very true of the United States. But what I've been watching Europe a bit, and particularly, now we're seeing that the German corporations are having some problems in China. Up until now, the Germans have been cheerleaders for China. And they've had great success in China, but now we're seeing that the German corporations in China are coming under pressure. And they also have substantial political influence in Berlin. So I think that all of the democratic countries need to think carefully about how they deal with their corporations who are also doing business in China, because we have to guard against the capture of our major corporate leaders by Beijing. It's you know they shouldn't be able to have the kind of influence that can enable Beijing to be an important factor in our political elections.
Alberto,
Well,
you
I
want
know
to add something? You want to
I'm
point
very,
out?
very familiar with Clyde's thoughts. So, and I've been following Clyde for more than 10 years. Clyde, what do you think we should do about all this?
Well, in the U.S., I think we should stop corporations from having the right to make political donations. It should be unlawful, in my view, for corporations to make political donations. I also think that when a corporation, say like Apple, when the CEO of that corporation is testifying before the Congress or otherwise speaking to audiences that have political orientation, I think he or she should be compelled to declare that they are significantly tied to China. So I think if Tim Cook, for example, is testifying before the U.S. Congress, he always introduces himself as an American CEO. I think he shouldn't be allowed to do that. He should introduce himself as a CEO whose production is entirely in China. It has to be made public what the pressures and the interests of these CEOs really are.
How about electric vehicles? Because on both sides of the Atlantic now, the Green New Deal is the main, I would say, goal of economic policy. It attracts a lot of subsidies.
Right.
It's the main goal for the next 10 to 15 and maybe beyond years. But the technology as of today to meet the targets of these decarbonization, electric transition, ecological transition is owned or for the most part owned by China. Electric vehicles are, the most visible aspect, but even solar panels, even wind farms, and so on and so forth. How is it possible that this obvious fact has not been factored in when launching the targets for the Green New Deal? How come that we've been so oblivious, I don't want to say blind, to the realities, and we have engaged in a major transition effort which benefits China disproportionately?
Yeah.
Has it
Well,
been just naivete, or is there something beyond naivete in your view?
yeah. Well, I think that um, our our economists, and our um, China experts and our major political leaders have just been very naive, and, and not thinking deeply about the implications. I mean, let's take Bob Zoellick, the former U.S. trade rep and former president of the World Bank, and he just had an editorial in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago, and I think that people like Bob and our academic political leaders for a long time have been living in what I call la la land. They've been living in some kind of a sealed capsule, because
In a cocoon.
let's take the example of solar panels. You remember that back in the around 2010, 2011, 2012, Germany was a major solar panel producer. It was the leading solar panel producer. Today it's China. Now, what happened? Did the Germans forget how to make solar panels? No. What happened was the Chinese decided that they wanted to dominate solar panels. And so the Chinese industry, together with the Chinese government, focused on the one hand, the government provided low cost capital, subsidies for investment in factories to produce solar panels. The Chinese government also raised tariffs. At that time, German solar panels were less expensive than Chinese. So the Chinese raised tariffs to prevent the Germans from getting into the market. And then they built enormous capacity. Now, one of the aspects of manufacturing is that you have economies of scale. In other words, the more you make of something, the lower the cost of each individual product. So the Chinese, with a big market, of course, they had the potential of huge economies of scale. So they protected their market. They said, you got to buy Chinese. And they produced like crazy. And by producing so much, they overtook the Germans as the low cost producers. They had bigger scale, they had lower costs. And so today, China has the lowest cost to produce solar panels, and they have been dumping them in the US, EU, and other markets. And the only way that the Germans could recover any kind of position in solar panels is if Germany would subsidize its industry. And Germany famously doesn't like to subsidize industries. And so China remains the dominant player. So what I'm basically saying is that in the free economic, free political countries of the West and of Asia and so on and
Market
worldwide.
economy, in mostly market economy.
Yeah. So there has to be a the governments have to react to the Chinese. So if you don't want to be dependent on China for your solar panels, then you have to be prepared to subsidize to some extent your domestic production. And if it's only one industry, that's maybe that can be handled. But what we're talking about, China has sought dominance and has implied industrial policies to achieve dominance in a wide range of leading high-tech industries. And the only way, in my view, for the democratic countries of the world to respond is, on the one hand, to limit their imports from China, and on the other hand, to engage in the investment necessary to achieve competitiveness with the Chinese. So we need. What I'm saying is, the free market, free democratic countries of the world need industrial policies in order to, and they need to recognize that China is not playing their game. They need to recognize that China is playing a different game. China's playing, we're playing the democratic countries are playing tennis, and China is playing American football. And American football is a much rougher game.
But would it be possible, or would it be one way to overcome this Chinese challenge, to have a free trade agreement between the US and the EU, maybe with other countries? I don't know.
No, I think this is a very important idea. I think that let's take the EU, the US, Canada, Japan,
Yeah.
Australia. Let's take the leading countries of the free world, which are running free markets. There should be a trade, call it the Free World Trade Agreement.
Exactly.
Not the World Trade Organization, but the Free World Trade Organization, something like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
So you can also protect this free trade from China or whoever doesn't play with the rules, doesn't belong to the governance system of market economies and democracies. But at the same time, you would enjoy the economies of scale that would make easier for market economies to build the capacity and be able to live up to the challenge posed by the Chinese, right?
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah. I think that's the direction in which we have to go. Yeah.
Alberto, up to you.
Easy to say, but as you can see, that we can't agree on anything, especially in Europe.
Europe is already a free trade area, so problem is to engage the US, which, given the chance that Trump might win the presidency, becomes more of a problem than I don't know in the past. How do you see that, Clyde? If Trump wins in November, would this perspective of having a free trade world organization be still on the table, or Trump will focus on a sort of protectionist approach?
Trump will certainly focus on protectionist approach, we here in the U.S. just, in my view, we have to do everything possible to stop Trump from becoming president. He would be a disaster. But I think that the idea of a free world trade agreement and organization is something that would be attractive to a lot of the public. Something that I've been urging Biden to adopt something like that. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that Trump will lose and that Biden will win. And if he does, then I think that we have some potential to do something positive with the free world. Let me add one other point, which is that a lot of the reason that we got into this mess is because our political analysts, our China experts, they all kind of believed that if we opened our arms and welcomed China into the free world, that China would inevitably become freer. In fact, George W. Bush made the comment that free trade inevitably leads to democracy. Well, it doesn't. And what China's doing is not free trade. And so I think that it's really important for the free world to recognize if it wants to stay really free, it needs to separate its trade regime from that of China.
Can we summarize what you just said in a slogan? Yes to free trade, no to free riding.
I like it. Yeah, I like it. Yeah, it's good. I like it. Yeah.
Okay.
No to tyranny and no to free riding. Yeah, that's good. I like it. Let's promote it.
Okay, great. Okay, Alberto, if you don't have any other comment or question,
Yeah, Clyde, that it's impossible to think that democratic countries can agree. It's a nice idea, but yeah, it may work out of desperation. Maybe.
Well,
The
democracy.
Germans are on the brink of having their car industry destroyed by the Chinese, but they don't seem to agree on erecting barriers,
Yeah.
issuing custom duties against them. Isn't it unbelievable?
Yeah. Well, I think as we all know, democracy is not easy, and democratic countries have a great tendency to quarrel among themselves. But I think if we got some of the majors, I mean, if the U.S. and the EU and Japan could agree on a free world, free trade kind of organization, others would come along. I was just in Singapore, and then this morning I picked up a newspaper that had an article about how Southeast Asia is increasingly embracing China and not not embracing the U.S. But what I saw from talking to leaders in Singapore is that, in fact, yeah, they have a lot of trade with China, but it's all Chinese imports. These famous trading countries in Southeast Asia, they don't export to China; they buy from China. And everybody says, "Well, China's our biggest trading partner." Yeah, it sells you everything. It doesn't buy anything from. So I think if we got a core group of significant free world, free trade countries, that would be a huge step forward, and even over time it would be able to expand. I hope. I think.
Great. Thank you, Clyde.
Okay, good to talk to you. Good to see you.
Great. See you soon.
Okay, good. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. And thanks
Bye-bye.
from all our subscribers and listeners as well.
Okay, thank you.
Ciao, Clyde.
All the best. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.